Actions at the top of your paragraphs, you might talk about Cain and Abel, and it does deal with that. But as you're reading what's going on in the arrival of Cain and then Abel, almost immediately the Bible starts talking about Cain and Abel worshiping or sacrificing. And the latter part of verse 4 says, and the Lord respected Abel and his offering. That was his worship. God was pleased with Abel's sacrifice, his worship. Verse 5 says, but he did not respect Cain and his offering. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. So there was something going on inside Cain's heart that wasn't going right. It was not because his worship necessarily was going bad. I think his heart was wrong in a variety of different ways. And that's why his worship didn't go all that well either. It's strange as we're looking at that passage, by the way, that nowhere is there anything mentioned about God commanding them to worship or sacrifice. It was just something they were doing already. So this was, I don't think, a byproduct of just knowing God. I think God was giving direction. And that's why Cain knew the difference between what was right in sacrifice and what was wrong. He didn't get it right. And so what I want you to notice just from the very start with, as we talk about worship, there are times in man's life where worship didn't go right. And as in Cain's situation also, there was a lot of other byproduct of that. He became envious and jealous of his brother, and eventually, as you probably know the story, he killed his brother. But it was all a matter of what was going on in worship over here. And because he chose not to do it right, he could have done it differently, as the Lord said, verse 7, if you do well, will you not be accepted? But he chose not to do it the right way. Isn't that strange? You know, if God were to come down to earth today and talk to all of these different religious groups, and you can just flip the channels and see what's going on a Sunday morning or Saturday or any other time, and you can see there's all kinds of things happening in the name of worship out there. If God were to come down and just put them all under this giant umbrella and start talking to them and say, if you'll do it this way, it'll be acceptable. I wonder how many would just say, oh, I'm not going to do that. And would it be the same? And I think possibly so, because as we know, the Bible being our guidance from God, and even those that, most of them anyway, claim to worship in the name of Christianity, used this as an instruction book. There are a lot of words from God that are already known. Well, just a thought to think about here. Now, if you go back one chapter, in Genesis 3, there's a discussion of Adam and Eve and first sin. And it's not necessarily out of worship, but I just want you to take note that Eve and then Adam chose to disregard God's word and chose to do what they wanted to do. As if to say, they decided to put themselves first. Now, here's a thought just to think about. If that was within their nature, I guess it is within all of us as humans in some sense, and they passed that down to their children, Cain and Abel, maybe you can see why Cain chose to do things his way too, in worship. Because that's what Mom and Dad did in the garden. And I don't think it erased, by leaving the garden, that general tendency, I'll just do things my way. And you see that happen. You see it in worship today. I'll just do it my way. And they're calling on God, and they're mentioning Jesus quite often in a variety of different things, and many of them are. And yet, you see all kinds of different worship going on. Deuteronomy chapter 6, there's an interesting comment that God made to his people. And I've talked about it from the pulpit, and you've heard it read before, and possibly taken quite note of it. In verse 10, as God's people are about to cross over into the promised land. Matter of fact, I think we even read this last week as we were talking about being thankful. The Lord warns them. He said, so it shall be, verse 10, when the Lord your God brings you into the land of which he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you large and beautiful cities which you did not build, houses full of all good things. Pause right there. Can you imagine today's setting? What would a house full of all good things be? Many of us have those, don't we? And it's a bigger range than what they had back then. But just, envision huge dens, plasma, well, that's not good enough plasma anymore, but the huge big screen, theater rooms, and on and on, just everything. You open the refrigerator, it not only is full of everything, it'll cook it for you. You just pass it right out the end. House is full of all kinds of good things. And as you read through the rest of it, as you're going through all the details, verse 12 says, beware lest you forget the Lord who brought you out. Now here's my thinking to start with. Just look around in the assembly here and recognize this is a pretty good gathering for a Sunday after Thanksgiving, where I know we have some that are sick. Don't think it was because they overate, but a lot of us overate during that. Did you get on the scale this morning, or did you even dare to think about it? But why are the houses full and the church buildings not? I think this is the reason, what we just read. We've forgotten what God's done. And as comes the tendency, we think we've done it. I heard an illustration a long time ago. It just came to mind here this morning as I was sitting there thinking about the guy that was talking about, he went out to his mailbox one Monday morning, or first of the month, and he reached inside and there was this bright yellow envelope, and he pulled it out and there was $1,000 in there. And he looked around like, where did this come from? And the next month, on the first Monday of the month, there was that bright yellow envelope, and he pulled it out. He's like, is there another? There was another $1,000. And on, the first Monday of every month, there was that bright yellow envelope. And it was so exciting because at the first of the month, as you could imagine, he was watching for that mailman to come. I'm there for that delivery. To me, my mailbox can sit with mail in it for 2 or 3 days before I realize, I forgot to get the mail out. But not this guy. Not on that first Monday. So this goes on for a couple of years, and one day he walks out to his mailbox right after the delivery, and he didn't see the guy sticking the yellow envelope, and he looked around and he goes, hey, it's not here. And he looked over, and the neighbor just down the way, he saw a bright yellow envelope going in there, and he yelled at the mailman. He said, hey, what are you doing with my envelope? Well, it never was his, in a sense. It just started appearing one day. I think sometimes of all the things that we have, we forget to give thanks to God for it because it's always been coming. Now, I know some of you don't have jobs. And a lot of us do. And some of us are quite well off. It's always been coming. But the product in our nation, when you look around on this Sunday morning, is that the blessings have been there, but the mindfulness of God hasn't been there. We've forgotten to worship. We've forgotten that God is the giver of all these things. Now here's the result. Romans chapter 1. Paul's writing this letter to a culture just like ours. It is affluent. It has got it together philosophically. It is astute with all of the great theologians of its time. All the professors gathered around. They've got the vast buildings, everything. They are in charge of the world. Are we not the superpower? In verse 18 it says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world," that goes back a ways, does it not? "For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that we're without excuse." We're without excuse if we look around to recognize that God put this world together. And I know there are scientists on both sides, and a lot of them saying there's no such thing as a God. And there are some, by the way, that are very qualified and astute too, that say, yes, there is. And they don't use science as their excuse. So God says you're without excuse. You ought to be recognizing, here's what happens as this goes on here. Because, verse 21, although they knew God, they did not glorify Him as God, nor were they thankful. They became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, you can just visualize guys with their doctor's degrees and piles of education, wisdom, and all, and things we make and all this stuff. Professing to be wise, they became fools. Talks about their heart being darkened. It's amazing how well this describes our nation, our society. It says that they didn't glorify God and they were not thankful. I think they just forgot about God so much that they just put Him out of their mind. He doesn't exist. I'm smart. I've got it taken care of. I know everything. And there's no reason for me to worship, to be grateful, to thank God for any of these things. And when you read down through what happened to those people, when they stopped thinking about God and stopped worshiping Him, verse 23 says, they changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and birds and four-footed animals and creeping things. They stopped worshiping and they started praising everything else like that was what it was about. And whether we do it physically bowing down or we just give it all of our time and focus, it's kind of the same thing. This is the product of not worshiping, of not recognizing God, of forgetting that the houses that are filled are only because God has done this. In verse 24 it says, therefore God also gave them up to uncleanness in the lust of their hearts, to dishonor their own bodies among themselves. And again, a clear description of our country and where we live. So it doesn't surprise me that our houses of worship are half empty on Sundays, because we've forgotten about God. And out of that, because we've stopped worshiping Him, we've started worshiping everything else. And we've gone off into lust and everything else. And is that not, again, descriptive of our country? And that's why worship's a basic thing. Because it puts us in a right relationship of where we should be as we think about God and what He's done and who we are. Worship comes from within our heart, out of what we owe God. First of all, because of who He is. God. That vision that Isaiah had in chapter 6 of the book of Isaiah, where he's watching the seraph flying around God. 6 wings, and 2 of them are covering their eyes, and 2 their feet, and 2 of them they're flying about with the other 2 wings, and they're crying out, holy, holy, holy is God. And Isaiah then, as he realizes this, and he sees how holy God is, all he can think of is how unholy he is. Woe is to me. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell among a people of unclean lips. And so here is a good capture of where we ought to be when we walk into the assembly. And we walk in grateful. And we think about we're stepping into God's presence. And we owe Him everything. For who He is. For what He's done for us. He is our Maker. Our sustainer of life. Paul spoke on Mars Hill, written in the book of Acts. It says, in Him we live and move and have our being. We would just utterly stop to exist if God stopped thinking of us, about us for just a moment. Everything we have depends on Him. Now, as you think about that, let's look over to Hebrews chapter 10 for just a moment. We think about what's going on in worship. We're going to start at verse 19, but pause for just a moment and look at your heart. No, we're not doing the invitation. Don't get your songbooks out. Look at your heart and look closely. I thought about this a whole lot just for me. Now, who might even stand here and talk about this? Full of sin. Can't get it right. Don't deserve to be in God's grace. Certainly don't deserve to stand up here and talk about it. And every one of us are of sinful nature. And verse 19 says, therefore, brethren, having boldness to enter the holiest by the blood of Christ, by the grace of God, Jesus dying on the cross, shed His blood, so that we walk in, as figuratively being described here, in the Holy of Holies, with the blood of Christ, and say we're clean. We can do it boldly. Verse 20 says, by a new and living way which He consecrated for us through the veil, that is His flesh, and having a high priest over the house of God, that's Jesus Christ. And then verse 22 then says, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. So we've got to get the sin out. We're coming boldly before God because of the blood of Jesus. We don't deserve it, but here we come. And as we come into His presence, we owe everything to God in our praise and our worship. And you come humbly and you come boldly, all together in one package. No, you don't deserve it. But God says you're cleansed. And you can come right up. And you do it with full assurance of faith. And you do it, verse 23, to hold fast to the confession of our hope. This is where I hold fast. You and I both have been in all kinds of different sizes of assemblies. I've preached on Sunday mornings where there's 6 people present. And it mattered to God. Little bitty church in the middle of nowhere in Argentina. Other places just like that in India. And here we gather. And God's watching what's going on. And He's wanting and deserving that worship. And that worship is having a change in our life because we step into God's presence. The same as it were for Moses when he walked into God's presence and when he left that mountain. You remember the description in the Old Testament? His face had changed. It had become radiant and glowing. There's a change that takes place as we come boldly before God. Ought to be. If we're worshiping the right way, our heart's in tune with God the way it ought to be, there's a change that happens inside us. Because we recognize we don't deserve to get here. We're like Isaiah, we're saying, woe is unto me, because I know how sinful I am, and yet God cleanses. And what a difference it makes. It puts us in a new platform. One that we don't get to deserve to be on, but yet just the same, God put us there, and He raises us up to that level to say, now there's where I want you to be. Walk it. Live it. Stand firmly on it. Make it change in your life, something like never before. And so, whatever size assembly it is, your heart and your God come together there. And it makes a difference. Now let's talk about getting it right here just for a moment. Let's go to a little obscure book in the Old Testament called Nehemiah. And that's not one of the minor prophets. It's all way down in the Old Testament. It comes after 1st and 2nd Kings and Chronicles, etc. And then Ezra and Nehemiah. Chapter 8 in Nehemiah. And God's people have always had problems, ups and downs in following Him. Old Testament and the New Testament. In our time and in their time. And as would be the case, the book of the law was being presented after it had been lost for a while. And Ezra, now in chapter 8, this scribe/priest, is being directed by the king to read the Word of God to the people. So verse 2 it says, so Ezra the priest brought the law before the assembly of men and women, and all who could hear with the understanding on the first day of the 7th month. Then he read from it in the open square that was in front of the water gate from morning until midday.